Good afternoon. I'm Alan Olmstead, and I'm the director of the Institute of Governmental Affairs here at UC Davis, and welcome to today's Policy Watch. On December 23, 2003, the American beef industry was jolted with its first case of mad cow disease. Since that time, the beef industry, the USDA leadership, and various consumer groups have been in a state of turmoil. Inquiring minds want to know just how serious is the threat of mad cow disease. There are many dimensions to this question, certainly the threats to human health, the threats to animal health, but also the threats to various facets of our economy. We have here with us today three distinguished University of California researchers to address various aspects of this question as to the threat of mad cow disease. Collectively, our panelists have an enormous amount of expertise on issues related to animal health, food safety, and agricultural trade. Leading off will be Dean Cliver, who's in the Department of Population Health and Reproduction in the School of Veterinary Medicine. Professor Cliver is an expert on food safety and water safety and has considerable public policy service on national committees. He will be followed by Jose Bervejillo. He is a researcher at the Agricultural Issues Center here at UC Davis and has expertise in the public policy and economics of cattle diseases. Our final speaker will be Daniel Sumner, who is the director of the Agricultural Issues Center and a professor of agricultural and resource economics. Professor Sumner has extensive expertise in the economics of plant and animal diseases and is a well-known expert on issues related to international trade in agricultural commodities. We'll start with Dean Cliver.
Thank you. As has already been said, December 23rd of last year was a very important date. Long before that, though, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, mad cow disease, had been present in the UK from 1986, and their outbreak peaked in 1992. They're still experiencing some BSE, but it's at a relatively low rate. The total by November of last year was 183,634 cattle that had been diagnosed with BSE, all slaughtered. And the United States became the 24th country to be diagnosed with BSE as of last December. BSE is a spongy degeneration of the brain that's caused by abnormal prions. This is a term for small proteins that occur naturally in our brains, cattle brains. An abnormal form of the prion resists heat and normal digestion, and it's also able to transform normal prions into abnormal prions on contact. In addition to BSE, why we've had scrapie in sheep and goats, and chronic wasting disease uniquely in North America. Scrapie is all over the world except Australia and New Zealand, but chronic wasting disease in sheep and elk in North America, not sheep, deer and elk in North America is a problem that we've been living with and been aware of for over 20 years. BSE has a 2 to 8 year incubation period in cattle. There isn't any treatment. There's no antemortem test yet, so we can't diagnose them until they're dead. And if left to the course of events, why the disease is fatal, but the animals are usually killed before that for diagnosis. Apparently, BSE is not transmitted from cow to cow, and probably never from cow to calf, although that's not absolutely certain. The outbreak in the UK apparently resulted from feeding meat and bone meal to cattle after their rendering system had been relaxed in the name of energy efficiency. So meat and bone meal that contained remains of BSE cattle fed to normal cattle apparently caused the outbreak. However, spontaneous occurrence of BSE in cattle also seems possible, at least to me. That is not something they ate, but just it happened. BSE is unlike some of the other transmissible spongiform encephalopathies in that it's transmissible by ingestion, by eating, to cats, humans, and to experimental rodents. Risk materials, the part of the bovine carcass that are particularly rich in prions, are the brain, the spinal cord, also retinas in the eye, tonsils, and the far end of the small intestine, but less importantly so. However, milk and red meat, and therefore products of milk, are not a risk as far as we know. Variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, then, is the human result of this. There was a classic Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease that's been known for many years and has been known to occur spontaneously in 1 person per million all around the world, worldwide, per year. And the difference became apparent when variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was recognized in the UK because it was affecting considerably younger people than were likely to get CJD. The incubation period of variant CJD or VCJD is apparently about 10 to 20 years, very often beginning with psychiatric symptoms, so that people who are coming down with this are first seen to be behaving abnormally. As a matter of fact, their behavior is probably more abnormal than the so-called mad cow. They tend to survive longer after onset than the people who have classical CJD. And something that isn't often told is that there's a genetic component to susceptibility. It looks like only about 40% of the human population are at risk of variant CJD, although nobody's wanting to bet lives on that as yet. As with BSE, there's no treatment for either CJD or variant CJD. They're both fatal. And the peak year for VCJD in the UK was 2000. So we're 4 years from that now, and the incidence appears to be declining. There were 18 cases diagnosed in 2003. The totals to date are about 146 cases in the UK. I think I had 143 on the handout, about 9 in all the rest of the world. The ratio of BSE to variant CJD in the UK was 1,284 BSE cows per human case. And quite certainly, these VCJD cases were contracted before the disease was even known to exist. Essentially, everybody who has come down with variant CJD was already infected before we knew there was such an ailment. As far as control measures are concerned at this point, why, we know that we're in the process, or have been since 1997, not feeding meat and bone meal to cattle. And this is typically, or it's supposed to be, not of any mammalian source. And not only cattle, but other food source ruminants aren't supposed to receive meat and bone meal from mammalian sources. Additionally, we're trying to exclude risk materials from the human food supply, again, principally brain and spinal cord, although that's being viewed differently in the United States than in other countries. Testing after slaughter. In the UK, animals are tested between 24 and 30 months of age at slaughter. If they're 30 months of age, they are not eaten in the UK. In the rest of Europe, varying from country to country, animals 24 months of age or 30 months of age or older are tested before their carcasses are released for human consumption. Japan uniquely tests all cattle at slaughter, including veal calves, which I happen to think is inappropriate. In the United States, the testing has been on suspect animals, those that were viewed as suspicious on antemortem inspection at slaughter. Additionally, downer animals that weren't able to walk into slaughter under their own power. And increasingly, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service of USDA has been trying to catch up on dead on farm animals, animals that died out in the producing areas and didn't get to the slaughterhouse at all. Now we're seeing an effort to expand the testing program in the United States, and I'm not entirely clear where that's going. Additional countermeasures, of course, are the import-export restrictions. As I said, we are 24th in the world to be diagnosed with BSE. We were excluding all bovine products from the other 23 countries, and now it's our turn. Additionally, we've had restrictions on who can donate blood in the United States for quite some time, and they're even more concerned about that in the UK. We're also placing restrictions on biologicals such as vaccines for use in humans and animals that may have bovine products in them. We have some quite rigorous restrictions on what's going into animal feed, and that's being escalated. Additionally, we're trying for a more coherent, cohesive, inclusive animal identification scheme that would allow animals to be traced from birth to slaughter or birth to whatever becomes of them. In my opinion, what we've seen so far, I don't think represents a substantial threat to human health in the United States. And I don't think it's really a threat to animal health. I do think that we have serious economic and political concerns about this, but I think some of the responses that are purporting to protect public health are going to have a net detrimental effect on food safety in the United States, because they will detract from our measures that are meant to control diseases that are killing people in the United States. And I don't expect to live to see anybody die of variant CJD here. So that's my little prepared piece. On to Jose, please.
Good afternoon. Let me start saying that yesterday for dinner I ate a stew with sausages in it, and they were pretty good. What I'm going to focus on is on marketing issues mostly. Trying to put some background on the livestock industry and issues on trade issues associated with this case of PSC. As you all may know, the U.S. is the largest beef producer in the world, with about 35% of total production, of the world production of beef. The farm sector receipts of cattle sales is about $40 billion per year in the United States, and 10% of that, I mean, the equivalent 10% of that is what is exported. The U.S. is also the #1 exporter in terms of value. It accounts for 27% of the worldwide exports of beef, and it's also the #1 importer with 25% of world imports. In 2002, the U.S. exported $2.5 billion in beef and offal and some beef preparations, of which a third goes to Japan. Japan is #1 market for the U.S. exports. And then Korea, Mexico, and Canada follow. So these four markets account for 90% of U.S. exports. But as I said, the U.S. is also a larger importer of beef, with exports and imports of fresh beef about the same volume and same value. The main provider of beef and cattle is Canada, and then Australia and New Zealand. Live cattle is also a very important commodity, especially between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Imports amount for $1.5 billion in live cattle, mostly coming from Canada. The U.S. export 9% of of production. 9% of the total production goes to export markets, and imports about 12% of local consumption. However, the beef that the U.S. exports is not the same as what it imports, so it cannot substitute perfectly one for the other. Mostly the U.S. exports high quality beef and imports manufactured beef. I'm going to say a few. This is kind of a framework of the livestock industry in the U.S. And I'm going to say now a few words on consumer behavior or demand behavior for beef and disruption of trade. With respect to consumer confidence, all the countries behave in different ways. Consumer markets behave in different ways. So if we look at the past BSE crisis, the responses of the public have been different. If we look at the UK after the crisis in '96, consumer demand for beef dropped drastically, but that was only a short-term step. Actually, the UK shows a very long-term trend of decreasing consumption of beef. And right now, the UK is consuming about the same beef per capita than it used to consume before the '96 crisis. Japan reacted in a somehow similar way with when they found three cases in 2001, consumption went down drastically, about 20%, and then slowly started recovering. But Japan is still consuming about 15% less beef than what it used to be, what it used to consume. Then there is a third case, is Canada, with this case last year in May. It was one cow. Canadians behaved in a completely different way. Consumption actually went up. And Canadians in 2003 consumed 5% more than beef than in 2004, than in 2002, excuse me. So the consumer behavior affects enormously how the impact of BSE extends. Then a few words on disruption of trade. After the BSE was found in Canada in May, Canadian exports went down drastically because all markets closed. But that situation lasted a few months. Actually, in last November, Canada was exporting about the same amount of fresh beef that it was exporting before the crisis. And the big difference between now and before is that Canada cannot export live cattle to the U.S., especially. Japan imports 1.9 billion of fresh beef and beef products every year, and imports account for 55% of local consumption. So Japan depends highly from the imports. It used to be higher, this. About half of total imports, of total Japanese imports, come from the US, and Australia is the other big provider. But again, what Japan buys in the US is not the same type of beef that it buys in Australia. They're not completely perfect substitute. For the US, if export markets remain closed for a long period of time, then what's happening and what's going to happen is that there is going to be an oversupply of beef, and the U.S. don't need to import beef anymore. But again, if the U.S. does not import beef, there's going to be an oversupply of a different type of beef, mostly high-quality beef. So one would expect that prices are going to go down for the consumer. And this will favor consumers, but it's also a negative effect on producers. In any case, keep in mind that cattle prices were extraordinarily high before the crisis and are still higher than 1 year ago. So although the prices of cattle decreased, they're still higher than the average or 5-year average. If the U.S. diminishes its imports of beef, Australia will not be able to substitute the U.S. beef in the Japanese market because the type of beef is not exactly the same. So the question that one may ask is how the consumers react in Japan and in other markets, but in Japan especially, if they cannot buy US beef and the Australians cannot provide what they want. And there's going to be a shortage of high quality beef in Japan market, prices are going to go up. And so I would like to end saying that when with an isolated case of BSE and public confidence still high as it is in the US and as it was in Canada, the negative effects of the crisis will not last more than a few months. Considering that there is a trade disruption and then a process of recovering of the trade. Livestock industry must process some changes because of the new regulations that are going to affect the profitability of the business. But the public may benefit from a safer production system and food industry, and all the way from the farm to the table. That was all I wanted to say, and thank you. And then later we can answer some questions. And I'll let Dan finish the exposition.
Dean suggested that the threat to human health from this single cow outbreak in the U.S. is minimal, and at least from what I read as a non-professional in that area, that seems to be the consensus among mainstream scientists. Given that, Jose and I then have been going forward asking what have been the reactions both in the industry, in the beef industry, in the United States and globally, and also what have been the reactions on the regulatory front. And I think Jose has summarized for you in a written form some of the safeguards and regulations that the U.S. has already adopted, and there are a number of those added. Dean referred to these. In addition, there's legislation being proposed in the USDA and the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, have been proposing additional regulations seemingly every day or two. I want to discuss a little about that regulatory side and then the trade reaction, and then open it to questions. One interesting phenomenon on the trade side, Jose mentioned that the Canadians ate more beef when there was this discovery of a BSE infected animal in Canada. That wasn't because they liked that idea. The price of beef fell quite dramatically in Canada. The reason for the dramatic price fall in Canada is because they export a lot of live cattle to the United States. They export a lot of beef. Their industry, as I think Jose said, is about half of their industry relies on exports. When the borders were closed in their export destinations, there was a lot of extra cattle and beef in Canada that was going to be consumed, in fact, by Canadians. So their consumption went up quite a bit, but that was as prices were falling. So they responded as economists expect people to. The same thing's happening in the U.S. And in fact, Jose mentioned we were at high cattle prices. They fell. That's on December 22nd. On December 24th, they were then down by about 20%. It was an immediate reaction. We know that from looking at the Chicago Board of Trade futures markets and spot markets. Prices fell by about 20%, and that happened in response to the immediate reaction around the world of basically blocking or eliminating the available demand for about 9% of U.S. cattle and beef. So that you reduced the demand by about 9% and the price fell. And that's in line with, in fact, estimates that people have used for the responsiveness of price to changes in demand. So at that stage, this was not happy news for the cattle industry. Some of the cowboys I know responded to Jose. Jose said prices were high. They said, yeah, we're making money for the first time in 5 years. So they didn't think they were abnormally high. They thought they were high like they should have been all the time. But those producers did face not losses in the sense they started with very low prices and they went further, but they started with healthy prices. They went down to probably more normal levels. but there was a clear and immediate profit hit on that industry. Let me turn to now the regulatory response. And I want to think out loud with you for a minute or two about how we are thinking about these regulations. Normally in the United States, when we have things that are called major rules, that's a particular classification that affect more than $100 million worth of economic activity in the country, there's a long process of deciding whether or not that regulation is worth it. There's a special category for human health threats. And so that the USDA and the FDA and others invoked that special category of rule for human health threats and immediately put some regulations in place. Now, however, we're going back and asking, do those pay off? And it's hard to think about it this way, but in fact, when we think about environmental and health regulations in this country, we really do ask, how many dollars per human life saved? And as Dean suggested, those dollars are scarce. You can devote them to childhood automobile safety, or you could devote them to testing for BSE. And when you do that, what we often find is, in fact, there's lots of variations. Some regulations are billions of dollars per life saved. Some of them are a few $100,000 per life saved. And I guess what many of us do is say, let's save more lives with a given budget if we can. And on that score, it makes sense. I guess I'm giving you a justification for why we want to think hard about these new regulations we're putting in place. Here, in fact, it's very interesting. Consumers seem satisfied in the United States that the beef supply is safe. We didn't see any consumer reaction in the United States or Canada to this reaction, to this. In the general statistics, there's isolated cases. Certain individuals, of course, changed their behavior. But the general statistics are that there was no particular consumer reaction to this BSE outbreak across the board. The data on beef consumption is very clear on that. And the experts are telling us that the beef supply was safe. Additional responses, in fact, that we're now talking about in a regulatory way are to satisfy the Japanese. And not to satisfy the Japanese consumers, but the Japanese government. Interestingly, those regulations then will allow that trade to start again sometime, maybe, if the Japanese government allows the beef in. What I want to point out to you is that those regulations will be paid for mostly by the 96 or 97% of the consumers that aren't in Japan, that is, mainly in the United States. And if you were to add even a penny or 2 pennies a pound to the cost of beef in the United States, given that it was already safe, I'm not talking about regulations that make it safe because it wasn't before, but if we start off with something and we say the supply is safe, but we have to satisfy a political demand in Japan, that's being paid for not by the taxpayers in the United States mainly, not even by the cattle industry mainly, but mainly by consumers in the United States will face a higher cost of a product. It doesn't take very many pennies per pound spread across the 97% of the production to make it a very costly reaction to have regulations to satisfy that 3% of demand. That's tough news for the cattle industry. They don't like to hear this because, in fact, lack of access to the Japanese market is costly to the cattle industry. But I want to throw that out because I think the regulatory side is clearly controversial, and I wanted to get some economics of regulation into this discussion as we go forward. I'll stop there, Alan, and turn it back to you.
Would either of you like to respond to that or make additional comments before we turn it over to the audience?
No.
But let me, Jennifer, you have a microphone, is that right? You have a microphone? So I'm going to ask the first question. How's that? Dean, you made a comment in your remarks that was, I think, very similar to the comment that Dan was making at the end, that there's a cost to this sort of regulation. And just what did you have in mind, and which diseases or would you direct your increased regulatory effort at, if at all?
Well, I'm not talking about increasing regulatory effort.
Okay.
I just hope we can sustain what we've been doing in the United States, but we are killing people with things like E. coli 0157H7, salmonella, some virus diseases, various other foodborne diseases, and the measures that we've tried to enact and tried to impart that will control those are going to be threatened by lack of budget. We're already seeing major cuts to our regulatory agencies, and I, for one, don't think that the regulatory agencies are our first safeguard. The industry is the first safeguard. But still, consumer activists who want a zero-risk food supply want more and more and more antipathy between the regulators and the producers. And along the way, why they say we want an absolutely safe food supply no matter what it costs, well, part of their stakeholders ought to be the hungry in the United States. We have 4,000 deaths from malnutrition per year here, 9 million people undernourished by World Health Organization standards. And when we talk about food security, food insecurity is defined by our USDA Economic Research Service, applies to not knowing that you're going to have enough money to feed yourself next week or your family. We have 33.6 million people in this country in that situation. So costly measures that don't accomplish anything are not only an imposition on people like me who are eating 3 meals a day, but on people who aren't eating regularly at all. I think in the United States, when it comes to food risk, not eating is much more dangerous than eating.
We have a question over here. Would you please identify yourself?
I'm Jill Miller-Theg, and I'm one of those consumers who actually has changed my eating patterns since this happened. And I came here today hoping that I would get some information about how safe our food supply is. And actually, I'm disappointed because I feel like I've only been told that scientific consensus is that it's safe without being reassured about what those scientific studies are or why I should believe it's safe. And my reading as a consumer has actually led me with more reservations than I had before this happened. I'm reading a lot of articles in the lay press that the USDA is actually just a lobbying arm for the cattle industry, and that in fact they've been looking not to find BSE very hard. So even though several panel members pointed out there's only been one case of BSE, I'm concerned that that's because we've been looking so hard not to find it. And so I'm kind of curious as to if you have more information that you could give about why you assume that the food supply is safe when I can't find that in the papers or in my reading. I just keep finding questions about what the USDA is or isn't doing, and I was very dismayed as a consumer to realize that until last month, the cattle industry was allowed to slaughter and sell for human consumption downer cows. It never occurred to me that in this country you could have a cow that was too sick to walk into the slaughterhouse and it would be okay with our government to sell it for us to eat.
Dean, you want to?
Well, let me start with that last because I think that that's a gross misrepresentation, even though our Secretary of Agriculture almost would say amen to it. We have an inspection system that entails seeing every animal before and after slaughter. Professionally trained inspectors. Those are not sick cows that get into the food supply. If an animal breaks a leg en route to the slaughterhouse and is otherwise sound, it will be cleared for human consumption. Otherwise, it simply won't. If it's a sick cow, it's not going into our food supply. That's what the whole inspection system that's been in place for close to 100 years is about. So downer is, as far as I'm concerned, a red herring. Beyond that, as far as what research has been done that would lead me to eat a steak from that cow if I had a steak from her before me, we are way behind in the United States. I've put in the last year and a half working on a committee from the National Academies of Science Institute of Medicine. This report was supposed to have come out last month, but I think they found need to put a postscript on it before it came out of the National Academies Press. But anyway, it's entitled Advancing PRION Science. It's about what the United States should be doing. We are years behind the UK and to some extent Europe as well in research on these subjects, so we are dependent on their findings. And I have, on this committee, worked with people who are from the UK, who've done the research, and they say that I'm not going to find abnormal prions in red meat, and I'm not going to find abnormal prions in milk. And they have explained to me how the tests were done. Time does not permit. But once again, I'm quite persuaded by that, because I've heard the people who did the work explain how the work was done, and these were the findings. Now, if the press chooses not to share that with the public, that's not my fault, because I have been very much available to the press since December 23rd, believe me. And it's all we can do to try and deal authoritative information. And once again, now I think where our government went wrong, and I've said this, is giving mixed signals. As soon as they said the beef from that Washington slaughterhouse is safe, but we're going to recall it and destroy it, that, I think, caused unnecessary angst in the consuming public. If they had stuck by their story, don't worry, eat hearty, I think we'd have felt much better. But we're finding all kinds of problems about communication regarding risk that associates with recalls, and we aren't doing a very good job of handling that sort of thing. But as far as safety is concerned, we're already doing more than enough, in my opinion, and I am concerned that we're going to wind up with a less safe food supply if we impose rigorous measures that are aimed at BSE, which will save 0 lives, and have to take the resources away from what we've been using to address other more threatening diseases.
There were several aspects to that question. One was that the USDA was nothing more than an advertising arm of the beef industry, or the industry more generally, and perhaps more generally captured by that industry. Dan, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think there's no question that the USDA, as frankly every other government agency, tends to work closely with the industries that they regulate. Depending on the administration, it goes back and forth. The Labor Department is often headed by someone who works with the labor unions, and on and on. The Commerce Department will be some business person. And Dean, I think, made some initial remarks that said you'll be more effective if you work with an industry rather than against the industry, if there's some working together on these things. And that's been generally the USDA attitude. My experience with USDA is that the USDA as a government agency is probably less captured by the industries that they regulate than are the members of the Congress, who in fact that are putting pressure on the USDA on behalf of industries. That's from personal observation, and in fact it's the members of Congress who are nominally representing the public at large, at least. I do think that oversight is incredibly important. The press oversight is incredibly important. Public oversight in general to make sure regulators do their job is important. But I don't see it a major issue within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The Food and Drug Administration also, of course, regulates food safety and has been weighing in on some of the BSE questions. USDA has responsibility for animal health and safety, and generally food safety related to meats, but FDA also plays a role there.
Next question.
This question is for Professor Bebehijo. I just pronounced that wrong. If the scientific consensus has been that there's minimal health risk related to mad cow disease, why has there been so much stress on banning imports? And do you think that was motivated in any way by economic protection for the U.S. industry? And has that import ban actually supported high prices for U.S. beef and dairy farmers?
Well, I think the decision of banning imports, let's say in Japan, Korea, or any other place, it's a political decision. It's not a decision that is based on an evaluation of costs and benefits in a purely economic sense. So the government of Japan feels that it's better off to protect their voters by banning beef from the U.S. Well, that might be not related to economic question. On the other hand, I think that there's going to be also a response from the public in Japan and in any other markets if they feel that the prices are going to go up unnecessary because some product cannot enter the market when they think that the product is safe enough. I don't know if you want to.
I want to add 30 seconds. I think the intuition in your question is exactly right, in fact, that the beef industries, the cattle industries in countries, potentially importing countries, do play a very influential role in maintaining the trade barriers, partly for simple, good old-fashioned economic protection. And there's also no question that a part of, and perhaps a significant part of the high prices for live cattle in the United States that we were experiencing on December 22nd was in part due to the fact that we had a ban on live cattle imports from Canada, which had been a fairly substantial trade. Cattle were fed in Canada, shipped here to be slaughtered in our slaughterhouses and then consumed in the United States. When that trade was blocked, that's one of the things behind rising cattle prices in the U.S. The cattle industry was very aware of that and supported that ban. Most consumers, well, what is it? Up 2 or 3 cents a pound on beef, you never noticed. And so I do think economic regulation also often does respond to industries. That's not that the agency is captured, but that's a matter of the political pressure put on by particular industries. And it's much easier to put bans on imports because in that case, you've got consumers saying, sure, fine, doesn't matter to us, maybe it makes it safer. You've got the domestic industry saying, great, we like it, higher prices. And the people that are complaining are all foreigners and they don't vote. So I think your intuition is exactly right on that score.
One other cost, though, that isn't being recognized at this stage is the impaction of the dairy industry in California. The animals that are old enough to be perceived as at risk typically are cull dairy animals. And so we're in a situation where we've got a lot of excellent beef that won't go out of the United States, and we're having more and more problems with rendering as far as what the renderers can afford to take. And I see cull dairy animals that should be moved out of a herd in favor of younger animals being very hard to get rid of. So they're not producing, you can't move them. Seems to me we're going to have cows on pension.
Nanette Miranda with ABC TV in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Fresno. Dean, earlier you were saying that there's going to be this call for more testing, and obviously just statistically wise, more testing would mean probably we'll find more cases. Then should we be alarmed that mad cow would be a risk to us as consumers?
In my opinion, no. Once again, it's about specified risk materials, and this is risk is in the eye of the beholder. In the United States now, risk materials are brain and spinal cord primarily from animals that are 30 months of age at slaughter. Before that, if an animal is slaughtered and it's inspected and passed by USDA inspectors, the brain is food. And there are, of course, ethnic markets in California where brain is regarded as special food. So in much of Europe, brain and spinal cord are never food. In the UK, a whole animal that's 30 months of age or more is not food. As I mentioned earlier, they don't eat animals 30 months old or more. That was a political decision and something that the UK consumer is willing to pay for, whereas after variant CJD was recognized and there was a real threat to human health, the government banned sale of beef on the bone in the UK. You couldn't buy beef with a bone in it either at a restaurant or at a butcher shop. That didn't last very long. Apparently the Brits were going to have their beef with a bone in it, and no amount of perceived threat of variant CJD from BSE was going to stop that. So I agree with with Daniel that we're probably going to see some consumer reaction about these kinds of things, and eventually I think people are going to demand that they want to have their food the way they want it.
So then at what threshold then should we be alarmed? 10 cases? 50?
Well, I said that the ratio of BSE to variant CJD was about 1,300 to 1, and all of the people that got infected in the UK got infected before we even knew there was such a disease. So my feeling is that we might have one person at risk in North America after the first 1,000 cases of BSE. But if we're taking the precautions that we are now taking, why probably we won't even see that.
My parents who live in Florida know a young woman who died in Virginia. She's about my age, and she died from variant CJD. She had traveled in Europe, so it's not clear where she contracted it. But once you know someone who's died from the disease, I don't think you can be as offhand about it as I used to be. And as the mother of 3 children, I'm still trying to engage in some sort of intelligent risk assessment, which I agree with the panel members is difficult. But for instance, I read in the newspaper a few weeks ago that animal scientists, one was from Berkeley and I think San Diego, were suggesting that if contaminated food meal were fed to even pork or chicken, that it could be transmissible that way. And I note in your notes you say that it can be transmitted in cats and cows and rodents. Are you aware of any studies to find out whether it's transmissible in poultry or pork? And a second question would be about recalls. Am I right in thinking that I just recently learned that the recalls by the USDA are not mandatory?
Okay, first pigs and chickens. I'm quite sure that these kinds of host range studies have been done in the UK, and partly they were sensitized by the fact that before the first case of variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans was recognized, cats were getting transmissible, called feline spongiform encephalopathy, apparently from eating risk materials from BSE cattle. So nobody assumed that it was restricted. Well, early on they assumed it was restricted to cattle, but once they knew it was jumping species, why, they looked at what other species were at risk. And to my knowledge, other than experimental rodents that are in many instances genetically modified to make them susceptible to these diseases, why, people and cats are the only identified, and by the way, cats are not one species. In addition to domestic cats, why, there were zoo species in the UK that came down with feline spongiform encephalopathy. So that has been pretty well explored. Now, as far as recalls are concerned, the recommendation of a regulatory agency almost always governs. I've known of one case where a company did part of what Food and Drug recommended and not the rest, and eventually we did some research to find out what the science was behind that, and the company was vindicated. On the other hand, though, USDA has been to Congress repeatedly to get what they want in the way of mandatory recalls. When the Hudson Foods Company was sent to bankruptcy by the USDA, that was orchestrated a week before Congress was due to vote. This would have been about 1998, before Congress was due to vote on mandatory recalls on that occasion. USDA put together what I thought was a lynching, and along the way they said they were sending in a SWAT team, and they kept leaking things to the press about all the terrible things that were going on in the Hudson Foods plant without ever once admitting that the Hudson Foods plant was under continuous USDA inspection. So this, as I say, I think was a totally orchestrated media event, and we keep hearing that, but it won't make any difference to the consumer. And once in a while, when government shoots from the hip, they can be wrong. So the fact that industry has a little bit of latitude, I think, is a useful thing.
Hi, my name is Sharon Stello. I'm a reporter from the Davis Enterprise. And I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the proposed testing and regulations and compare that to what's done today.
Thank you.
Did you hear? Well, I'm trying not to.
Let's let Dan.
30 seconds worth. I think on a handout that Jose circulated was some of the safeguards and regulations that have recently been adopted after the recent outbreak. So if you have that handout, that's one thing so we no longer allow downers into the food chain, and there's several other regulations mentioned there. There's additional regulations. I don't have the specifics in front of me here. Jose might have them. And legislation. Now, there's always legislation suggested in these cases. Most of it never does pass, so there's a question about how seriously to take some proposed bills when they get into Congress. With that as background, I just wanted to be clear what we're talking about. Maybe Dean has more, or Jose has more.
No, just Dan referred to some proposed legislation. There's several bills, proposals in Washington by different representatives regarding testing and health protection. And there's some other regulations, some in place, some under study regarding the use of chicken litter for feedstuff and that kind of stuff.
There are proposals to have mandatory testing for every animal that's slaughtered in the United States, like the Japanese have. That's one that's unlikely to be pursued very far, at least unless there's another outbreak or a substantial one. There's also mandatory livestock identification, traceability that would be mandatory from the government. Let me say, as an aside, there'll be more and more traceability, not just of cattle, but of other livestock products and fruits and vegetables. Where consumers demand that, that's going to follow. That's happening now. It's in fact happening very rapidly throughout the food system. This BSE outbreak will encourage that to happen without regulation. But there's proposals to make it mandatory for beef. There are proposals for mandatory testing for all animals over 30 months, for example. That's a little less stringent than the others. With respect to the chicken litter, the idea there is that if parts of cattle can be fed to chickens, then the chickens don't eat all the food, the feed spills on the ground, that's swept up. Could that then somehow get back to cattle? So there are proposals that you eliminate feeding the cattle parts to the chickens at all, and then you'd cut out that very indirect but still possible channel for some of that to get back into the cattle feed. So those are the kinds of regulations and legislation that are being proposed.
Okay, but I think the question was specifically about testing. Is that right? Okay, well, there aren't, anyway, about testing, there aren't any antemortem tests. So you got to kill the animal to find out if it had BSE. What is tested is the brainstem, a segment called the obex, which is done in a laboratory. Sometimes the laboratories are near at hand. In Europe, why they have a turnaround time that they can clear the carcass the next day. But when we start, as the Japanese have done, I won't say when we start, when the Japanese started testing veal calves, it is known, one, that the available tests aren't nearly sensitive enough to detect prions at the levels that they might ever occur in a calf. And two, that the distribution early in the infection does not involve the obex. So you carefully take the head off the calf, take out the obex from the brainstem, send it to the lab, and you might just as well flush it down the toilet. But in Japan, they're still doing that. And I have to entertain a delegation of 4 Japanese tomorrow morning, and maybe this won't come up. But when I was in Japan right after the first diagnosed case, I got to talk to a member of their parliament about how inappropriate I thought this was. And I told him I thought it was like getting 9 women pregnant in the hope of producing a baby in 1 month.
I don't see how we can top that, so let me thank our panelists and thank all of you for attending.